And so we're going to really concentrate our presentation today on those issues that are particularly troublesome at a time of transition. Some inherently so, and some just because of where people find themselves when they come into the government.
Right. And some of the travel issues are, of course, addressed to federal employees, and to the extent that we have folks working the presidential transition, what is their status regarding official travel, regarding relocation of the volunteers or the paid presidential transition folks, and to what extent is the government going to pay any relocation and under what circumstances. We're going to talk a little bit about, do they have access to the contract city pairs, the airline city pairs contracts, and then we'll talk about some of the rules that apply to employees, and that we probably would like just to have a refresher for some of the folks here at the OGE Summit. And we'll talk about, when do you use premium class travel, under what circumstances, use of government vehicles. We'll talk about a WAG versus 1353 versus the Foreign Gifts Act. We get questions frequently that attach to that, but we'll start off talking about the presidential transition and what the nature of those individuals are, and to the extent that any travel regs apply to them.
Now, with the transition, since there are likely going to be a lot of people who may not have been served in government before, are there additional issues that deal with that, or how do you address those people who may not have been in the government service?
Well, as far as travel is concerned, most of those folks will come in to work on the transition. They're not deemed federal employees until their appointment, and to the extent that they're appointed to an agency, what are the agency's responsibilities? What are they authorized to pay for? And can the transition folks use government vehicles when they're performing transition duties? We'll talk about that. And of course, Dave has his perspective on ethics.
And then once the new administration comes in, as you alluded to, you're going to have people here who haven't been in the government. So obviously, one thing that's going to strike them very strange is, as senior executives on a business trip to Europe, that they're not allowed to fly business class. So we're gonna have to reacquaint them or acquaint them with the rules on business class travel. That's going to be a key issue for them. My experience has been there's always at least one or two people in administration who keep their home back in their home state. So that raises questions about travel to and from that place and how you combine that travel with official travel. And then before the transition, the session's also going to cover things that come up in transition years. And so I'm going to be talking a little about campaign activity, how you allocate travel expenses for campaign activity, travel to the conventions, all these things that many ethics officials are going to be faced with in the next few months.
Is there one or two key things that you would like people to take away from your session?
Well, as far as the travel, I think one of the more important, the ones we get probably more inquiries concern: when do I use the WAG? When do I use 1353? Do they ever intersect? Do you always use 1353 when you're on travel? When do I use the Foreign Gifts Act to accept travel? And even in certain circumstances, travel for training. So there's a number of authorities, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I think we get, probably for purposes of the ethics areas, we get probably more questions surrounding acceptance of travel payments.
Okay.
And my takeaway is that you've got these people coming into the government who haven't been in the government. We consider we're ethics officials, but many of the rules that we apply to them are not intuitive ethical norms. For example, on the business class travel, if they aren't told they can't do that, they're not going to understand why they can't do that. They're coming from private industry. They owe duties to their stockholders, and they've always felt it's a good use of government of stockholder resources to fly them business class because they'll do their job better. Intuitively, they're going to start with that same premise when they come here. It's not a question of being unethical, but as you know, the rules just don't allow that. So getting these new people acquainted with the rules, especially the ones that aren't going to be intuitive for them, and and really to protect them from making mistakes that they might make without even thinking about it, just because they'll be using judgments that aren't wrong but aren't applicable in a government setting.
Okay. Well, great. Well, we're definitely looking forward to that session. Sounds like it'll be a great source of information. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for
Our pleasure.
agreeing to
Thank
speak.
you.
So that session is going to be taking place here at 3:15. And by the way, I love the title of the session. You say hello and I say goodbye. Are you going to sing the title of the session or no?
Well, certainly not until the end, because we want people to stay.
Okay. Well, be sure to join us for that session here again at 3:15. Thank you.
Thank you.
to go ahead and get started with this next session.
Whatever it
If
is.
a few people still wandering in could get yourselves comfortable.
Interesting discussion.
So, well, thank you for coming to a lot of good sessions. I see Justina nodding, so it must be true. I always try to single her out at least one session. As you know, we've been focusing on the presidential transition as our big theme for this summit. It's so important that we be ready for the transition. And we've had a lot of sessions where we focused on the very practical aspects of getting ready, building expertise, streamlining procedures, and looking at what kinds of resources we can leverage to be able to deliver an effective transition. We're going to have one session where we have a little bit of fun and try to picture the world as it should be. I've dealt with so many of you ethics officials over the years, and I haven't met one who doesn't have a strong opinion, myself included. And so what I thought would be exciting to do is assemble a panel of genuine experts here to share their recommendations for the next administration. Right now, they're focused on winning an election. They're focused, hopefully, on preparing for the transition. But the next question they'll have to answer is, what do we do now that we're in charge, whoever wins? And I've assembled a panel here. I'll introduce them to you. These are people I've worked with before. I admire and respect them greatly. Many of you know many of them from past dealings. And the fun thing is they don't all necessarily have the same views, which is a good thing because there are a variety of different perspectives. You get 4 ethics officials in a room and you get 5 or 6 different views. And, you know, we're going to recommend to the campaigns out there that they watch some of the sessions we've live streamed. We're live streaming about half of the sessions, and we tried to put all of the juiciest, most interesting ones to the outside world online. Not to take away from the great ones that we didn't live stream. They're very interesting to us too. We tried to focus on the outside interests on the live streaming ones. And I'm hoping maybe if one of the candidates or their staff hears something they like from one of these gentlemen up here, they'll reach out to them for more advice on the next administration, what they should do in the way of ethics. We're happy to put you in touch with them. So with that premise, I'd like to introduce the panel that I've got here. And I've got my notes in a different order than they're sitting, so I will fumble through them here. Immediately to my left here is Gregory Walden. He's a senior counsel at the firm of Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld. Mr. Walden served in government as an associate counsel to President George H.W. Bush, focusing on government ethics. His government service also included service as chief counsel of FAA, as associate deputy attorney general, as a member of the Interstate Commerce Commission. And of particular relevance to us, his law practice has included advising presidential nominees and appointees, as well as presidential candidates on financial disclosure, conflicts of interest, and the standard of conduct. In addition, he's an author whose writings include a book on government ethics. Deb Borteau, our nominee program branch chief, and I have worked with Greg on a number of nominees, and we worked with him during the last election as we were reviewing his candidate's presidential candidate financial disclosure form. Next to Greg is Richard Painter, who many of you will remember. He's a professor at the University of Minnesota School of Law. He's also a reporter for the American Law Institute's Project on Government Ethics. He served in government as an associate counsel to President George W. Bush, focusing on government ethics. He practiced law with Sullivan and Cromwell in New York City and with Finn Dixon Hurling in Stamford, Connecticut. He served as a tenured member of the law faculty of the University of Oregon School of Law and the University of Illinois College of Law. He's also an author of books on government ethics and campaign finance reform. Many of you here will remember working with him as we did nominee reports in the last administration. The next one over is even more recent memory for many of you, is Norm Eisen. He's currently a visiting fellow with Brookings Institution. and he was previously the U.S. ambassador to the Czech Republic, and before that, he was special counsel to President Barack Obama. In that capacity, he helped lead the Obama administration's initiatives on government ethics, lobbying regulation, and open government. Before entering the administration, Ambassador Eisen was a litigation partner in the Washington, D.C. law firm of Zuckerman Spader. In 2001, he also co-founded Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or CREW, a government watchdog group. And I know many of you worked closely with Norm only a few years ago as he was leading the White House's ethics program. Next to him is Craig Holman, another familiar figure. He's currently government affairs lobbyist for Public Citizen, a government watchdog group. As legislative representative, he serves as the organization's Capitol Hill lobbyist on campaign finance and government ethics. Previously, he was senior policy analyst at the Brennan Center for Justice, New York University School of Law. Among other notable activities, Dr. Holman worked closely with the effort to pass the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act, or HLOGA, the federal lobbying and ethics reform legislation enacted in 2007. He's also focused on campaign finance reform. And folks at OGE have worked closely with him on a number of things. We've tried to provide our take on some of the projects he's worked on. And last but definitely not least, on the far end there, we have Sean Moulton. He's the Open Government Program Manager at the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO. In that capacity, he oversees the effort to develop a blueprint the next president can use to build an open and accountable administration. Over the years, he's worked on transparency and government accountability issues. He's authored reports, testified before Congress, submitted comments on proposed regulations, and helped launch public disclosure websites. Before coming to POGO, Mr. Moulton led the open government activities of the Center for Effective Government. So we've worked a lot with POGO over the years as well. So we've got some great panelists here. What I'd like to do before we sort of have a discussion is give each of them 5 minutes. And because we have so many, Matt's going to help keep us honest and give us a warning when we're running near the 5 minutes. So I'll be strict. But gentlemen, in 3 to 5 minutes, can you each briefly share your recommendations to the next administration regarding government ethics? Greg, we said we'd start with you, so he won the coin toss. Let's let Greg roll. Matt,
the shortest straw. One step, repeal Executive Order 13490, its entirety. Now, in my 5 minutes, I'm going to get to some principles for a new administration that was in the book I wrote back in 1996, but I think are timeless and perennial. But on the executive order, I think it can be repealed in its entirety without a reduction in the integrity of the administration. I think the clear message may have been a bias against lobbyists or former lobbyists coming into the administration. But the clear message I took from it, and I think most people take from it, is that executive order does not trust the president, the White House, the administration, Office of Government Ethics, Office of Legal Counsel, the cadre of ethics attorneys to keep the administration above board. The existing statutes and regulations, in my opinion, are sufficient. I don't think we got that much out of the executive order. And what did we get in terms of an impact? Well, we don't know. It can't be empirical, but anecdotally, at least, we've driven a lot of people away from seeking appointment in the Obama administration who otherwise would be talented and qualified. So with this bias against lobbyists, who are the favored status? Well, if you worked in a state or local government, or you're an academic, okay, now you're in a privileged status, but lobbyists and academics and persons who work for state and local governments, when they're contacting the government on behalf of a client or on the are exercising their First Amendment rights. On the impact of the executive order, I want to read something that came out just a week ago. This is a senior official at the Pentagon. We used to have very, very talented, the best and the brightest people in government. They'd come in from industry for a few years, they'd make a contribution to their country, and they'd go back and nobody assumed they were a crook. I think we've gone too far trying to protect ourselves from the rare person who's really going to do wrong, and we deny ourselves an enormous amount of talent. Well, I think that statement took a lot of courage because it's from an existing Pentagon official in the Obama administration. And I think the executive order may have been the first systematic effort to disqualify otherwise qualified and talented, experienced individuals from working in an administration at any level of political rank, simply because of their experience outside of government. Pre-existing employment restrictions, I call them pre-existing employment restrictions. You have the scarlet L on your forehead. You try to wipe it off, and how many hundreds deregistered after President Obama was elected, thinking, okay, now we could go in, but they didn't realize the executive order would be 2 years. You have to sit out, or you can't go in to where can't you go in? You can't go into the very agency or department where you have experience and knowledge. And so you're disadvantaging the people who want to contact the agency and work through the process. The more experienced you are, the more knowledgeable you may be, if you've got that lobbyist level, that lobbyist label, you're not wanted in that department or agency. The concept in the executive order, using the term like particular matters and then applying it to regulations, well, how about that for vagueness and imprecision? Has that been easy to deal with? I don't think so. Former employer excludes state and local governments. Once again, bias against lobbyists, even though they're exercising their First Amendment rights. Now, I would say that on post-employment restrictions, if you get into the first part of the Obama administration and you leave, for the rest of the Obama administration, 6 or 7 years, you can't contact any political appointee in the whole administration. Now, where is the appearance of impropriety going from one agency to another agency across town on an issue that you never dealt with? I would recommend also, to attract the best and the brightest, that we have a little bit more flexibility on net worth, using net worth instead of just a regulatory waiver. I think the principle of you have to, or the policy that you have to resign from nonprofit boards where there's no conflict and there's no reduction in the time that you're spending in your government job, I think is overbroad and really, I think may have discouraged some people from pursuing appointments. So I know I'm running out of time, but when we come back, I would like to review some of these principles that I recommended in 1996 that I think are still valid today.
Thanks, Greg. And I didn't even have to sound the ding. But I will, I warn you, gentlemen. Okay, so Matt reset the clock and we're going to let Norm go next. I had told Norm he could go second. So Norm, when you're ready, Matt will start the clock.
Well, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back, to see so many familiar faces and friends and colleagues. Thank you for having me. It will come as no surprise to anyone in the room that I have a somewhat different perspective on the Obama Ethics Executive Order. Perhaps some of you have seen this. There's a study that a group of very distinguished Princeton political scientists issued, in which they say that the United States is in danger of losing its status as a democracy, and that we are slipping as a nation in the direction of the rich and the powerful and the special interests having too much power. These political scientists contend that we're at risk of becoming an oligarchy unless we take strong measures. I think the American people on both sides of the political spectrum are articulating a similar concern this election season. And that threat pointed at the beating heart of the democracy. It's so precious to us that all of you spend every day defending, is the reason that I would strongly recommend that the next administration, whether Democratic or Republican or third party, not only embrace and continue the Obama executive order, but even expand and strengthen it. The concept of the executive order was to learn from the experience of previous administrations. I don't believe, I challenge anyone in the room, including my fellow panelists, to name a single prior White House, EOP, or administration that has had fewer revolving door and related quid pro quo ethics scandals than this one. In fact, this White House is recognized not just by those who are self-interested, which I freely admit to being, but by independent experts as being the most scandal-free in modern presidential history. No convictions, no prosecutions, no indictments, no grand jury investigations, no subpoenas. It's been devastating for my friends in the Washington, D.C. Lawyer community to have a White House of this quality. I submit to you that is not a coincidence. The ethics executive order and the tough rules that it has set up are causally related to the outstanding performance of the White House and the administration. It's not to say it's the only cause. You all know, tone at the top, the president's integrity matters greatly. But there have been many other presidents of integrity whose administrations and White Houses have been plagued by revolving door and other ethics scandals. Certainly, if you were to look in the recent past, you'd be hard-pressed to find a White House that didn't suffer from those challenges. So in terms of getting qualified people to serve, I can tell you, and there's a number of folks in the room who worked with me in the White House when we were, and the transition, when we were setting things up for Obama, we had a flood of highly qualified applicants. We had hundreds, or in some cases even thousands of great applicants for many of the positions. I just don't think it's true that there's a dearth of great applicants, and to the extent people are discouraged, it's because of congressional shenanigans and other factors having nothing to do with the executive order. So, in my view, I would recommend continuing the EO and some of the other dramatic innovations that this administration has pioneered that reinforce it. For example, putting all the visitor records on the internet is a reinforcer for the high standards we establish, because it lets all of you and every American monitor who's coming and going and lobbying in the White House.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Norm. And he almost made it in 5.
By the way, if this were a Republican debate, I'd raise my hand and you'd recognize me.
Sure, sure. We will come back to everybody, I promise. We're going to now go to Sean, who I hope can inject some energy into this sleepy debate. Matt, have you reset the clock? All right, Sean, fire when ready.
Well, thank you for having me. And I'm not sure I can get to too much higher energy level than Norm, but I do want to interject a few new ideas in a moment. But first, I wanted to echo what Norm said, which is I firmly believe that the executive order should be maintained and expanded. I think that to state that the positions and policies established in the executive order represent some sort of mistrust of you as government ethics officials or of everyone coming in a new administration is a vast overstatement. And you know, go back to Ronald Reagan: trust but verify. These are smart policies that protect us against the worst conflicts of interest. There are abilities to get exemptions, and if we need to tweak the policy as we expand it and learn from it, then that's fine. But a full-fledged retreat would represent a tremendous loss from our perspective. So I don't think it'll come as a surprise to anyone here, given my title as Open Government Program Manager, that one of the ideas that I'd like to stress is transparency. I think we need more transparency. Norm actually raised a good example right at the end there as he was running out of time of the White House visitor logs. And it was a real step forward. And in fact, it's the kind of step forward that I think we need to build on, or the next administration should build on. The White House visitor log right now doesn't really do everything it should do. It tells you who comes to the White House, but it doesn't tell you who the White House is actually meeting with. If those meetings take place, say, across the street in a coffee shop, as sometimes covered in the Washington Post, then that's not in the White House visitor logs. And so what we really need to do is we need to start getting a better set of logs of meetings that are taking place and their topics, and not just for the White House either. We need to have this happening at the other agencies, especially the regulatory agencies. Those meetings are where influence is exerted. We need to know who's in those meetings, their potential backgrounds, and I think that's something that allows a lot of people to become inspectors and reviewers, journalists, academics, outside nonprofit groups such as POGO. I also think another area where we need better transparency is in post-employment statements. We have post-employment statements coming in and reviews by ethics officials to make sure there's no conflict of interest. But most of the time, that information is very hard, if not impossible, for the public to access. There's a DoD database that's been established by law, but you can't get access to it. And matter of fact, POGO issued a FOIA request for the database, and after 5 years of patient waiting for that FOIA request to be responded to, just a few months ago, we got our response, which was, you're going to have to go talk to a different agency about that. We don't have it, which was frustrating. To sit there and wait and hope that you're going to get information that is about ethics and good government, and then to be told you've got to wait in another line. And so we shouldn't have to wait at all. This is information the government should be figuring out a way to put up. If there are privacy concerns, those are concerns that we can address. To simply, again, shy away from the idea that disclosure is a huge factor in ethics is a mistake. And I think the other thing is, another aspect of transparency is ethical transparency during the operations. We talk a lot about the revolving door, people coming in, people leaving. But there's a lot about the transparency of what they do while they're in government that should be more transparent. And I'm thinking about contracts and grants that are being issued. We typically don't have access to either the award documents to see exactly what the government is giving the money for, nor do we have information on what we got for that money, any kind of performance assessment. Another one that I'll hope to go into more later, but I'm running out of time, would be interagency review. When reports or regulations are bouncing around between agencies and a lot of edits and a lot of changes are made, and we never find out who made those changes, why, and what their background was. And we've seen scandals before where people are making such changes for political reasons and for potentially financial reasons. So
Ding.
I'll stop there.
Ding. That's very good. Matt was holding up 5. I thought that meant 5 seconds. He means 5 minutes. Point at me vigorously, Matt, when 5 is up, and I'll ding vigorously. But thanks, Sean. That was great. We're now going to go to Richard and then Craig, who have patiently waited their turns. Richard, are you all set, Matt? Okay, we're ready to go. Go ahead and fire away, Richard.
January 20th of next year, a man or a woman will stand in front of the American people and take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States and to faithfully execute the duties of the office of president. And that happens every 4 years, and ever since the founding of our republic, and I think we take it for granted. Isn't necessarily always that way in a representative democracy. And I think we've all seen the old newsreels of the last years of Weimar Republic, a Republican form of government that only lasted a little more than a dozen years. And the party leader standing there in front of the crowd, people raising their right hands, there, an oath to him, that saying allegiance to him. And what drove that? What destroyed representative democracy there? And you study what happened, and it was the lack of public confidence in the government that was a large part of it. Perception of incompetence, perception of conflict of interest, that the government was there for the rich and the powerful, that the government was not there for the ordinary people, anger, anger that could easily be stirred up and directed at large groups of people based on their religion, on their ethnicity, a situation that spiraled out of control. And representative democracy is not something to be taken for granted. We've had it for over 240 years, but we need to protect and defend it. And I would suggest that it's our obligation as citizens to make sure that that kind of thing never happens in America. And we here in this room are in the front lines of the battle to protect democracy, representative democracy in this country, because what you are doing day in and day out in your work is about preserving the integrity of the government and the public confidence in our government, and avoiding a situation where the electorate is so angry that they start to move toward the political extremes and reaching for simple solutions which could destroy a representative democracy. And I think that part of what we see in that Princeton study that Ambassador Eisen referred to, these are the warning signs that we need to think seriously about public confidence in the integrity of our government. And government ethics is what that is all about. It's a large part of the picture. So I would suggest to the next administration, first, that we need to retain the executive order, perhaps expand it, but we need to enforce it. There's no point having an executive order if it's not enforced. And I know that good efforts have been made to enforce the executive order under this administration, but we need to expand that and to be vigorous in enforcing conflict of interest rules. It destroys public confidence in government when you have a revolving door that is spinning as fast as a revolving door we have in Washington. Taxpayer money, billions of dollars, was thrown at bailouts under the Bush administration and the Obama administration. Bailouts of the automobile industry, bailouts of the banking sector. I mean, indirectly, if not directly, most of the major banks were bailed out by the taxpayer in 2008 and for practical purposes, became government-sponsored enterprises for a while. And then we have Fannie and Freddie bailed out at the cost of the taxpayer. Particular party matters. That destroys public confidence when you have the appearance, if not the reality, of government officials working on those particular party matters, going out in the private sector and representing back on the same particular party matters. It is the job of government ethics lawyers to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen, but it's inside the agencies where we need the training. So the agency officials can say no when the former government official is calling up and making a contact they should not make. We need to have a strong ethics establishment in this government. And one of the things I would recommend to the new president is, and to the Congress, and actually I recommend it to this president, is that there needs to be a dramatic increase in the budget of the Office of Government Ethics and the the agency ethics offices. And the director of OGE should be singing in on the highest level meetings. We need to take this job seriously. And if we don't, and we don't take government ethics and integrity seriously, I think our democracy is at risk.
Okay. For the most part, I'd like to keep things going and not weigh in, but he said something interesting that about a promotion for me.
You're just happy because he argued for a raise for you.
That's
Walt.
right.
Yeah, you just don't want to sit in on those cabinet meetings.
So I kid, of course. I'm very happy where I am. But to the next president, no. So again, last but not least, as I like to say, I want to give Craig 5 minutes, and he's been a good sport, having lost the coin toss. So Matt, if you want to tee up 5 minutes, Craig, go for it.
Well, a beautiful day to be indoors for a conference. Jack Abramoff, the disgraced lobbyist, who is now, by the way, a friend of mine, once told me that the most pernicious yet most effective tool he had available for him for corrupting Congress, was his focus, was the revolving door. it worked very well for him. There was a period in which he never lost in terms of any of his lobby campaigns, and he attributes that largely to the revolving door. The revolving door, I want to explain, there are two different elements of it. There's the regular revolving door that most people are familiar with, where once you leave government service, you take a job as a lobbyist to influence the same colleagues in government that you worked with earlier. The other part of the revolving door that hasn't received much attention until Obama's ethics executive order is the reverse revolving door. This is known as regulatory capture, where special interests or corporations try getting their colleagues, their CEOs, their lobbyists into the positions of running the governmental agencies that oversee them. There are many, many ways of facilitating this reverse revolving door and regulatory capture. One of the most blatant that we just came across recently is called the Government Service Golden Parachute. This just amazed me. I first heard about it with Jack Lew, and I didn't even know it existed. Any company, any reasonable company offers a bonus as an incentive to stay with the company and, you know, a motivational tool. But there's a different type of bonus that we've just run across in Wall Street called the Golden Parachute, where groups like Citibank will actually write into their contract for Jack Lew that, you know, you work here, fine, even if you only work here for 6 months, if you get a government position with an agency that oversees us, we'll pay you $1 million. And so suddenly we have a bonus that isn't for employee retention, but it's actually to boot them out the door to become a government regulator overseeing the same business. Citigroup, at first, when I complained about this, I complained to Eric Holder, thinking that's in violation of 18 USC 209, which many of you are familiar with. I learned that there was a court case that said, no, this law that prohibits any government regulator from taking compensation from an outside source only kicks in once you actually become the regulator. So if you get your $1 million bonus the day before, that's perfectly fine. And we found out that this is common practice among Wall Street. It isn't just Citigroup. It's a number of other Wall Street institutions that offer these types of golden parachutes. So what I am committed to working on with many other groups, AFL-CIO, Public Citizen, Common Cause, you name it, a wide variety of groups, is we want to try codifying that ethics executive order. To tell the truth, I was and it remain somewhat concerned that no matter who steps into the White House, they may repeal the ethics executive order. So I'd like to see it codified. We have drafted a legislative vehicle to do exactly that, called the Financial Services Conflict of Interest Act. It's been introduced by Senator Baldwin and by Representative Cummings. What it does is, first of all, bans the government service golden parachute. Secondly, it not only codifies the ethics executive order, but it expands it. When it comes to the reverse revolving door, it doesn't just require government officials to sign an ethics pledge saying we won't take official actions affecting our former employers or clients within the last 2 years to presidential appointees. It applies it across the board to everyone in the financial services regulatory agencies that has a managerial capacity. So it expands that. It also expands the regular revolving door to include, once you leave government service, you not only are prohibited for 2 years from making a lobbying contact, you're even prohibited from doing lobbying activity, such as providing consulting services, organizing a lobbying campaign, you know, which is frequently done at this point. So we're trying to get this legislation in the middle of the presidential campaign,
ding.
and we're succeeding.
So, Craig, I cut you off there. You will definitely get a chance to talk about that some more. I have a series of questions for these fellows. We had a lot of conversation beforehand, and we've talked about some topics, but I also want to let it go where they want to go. And so my real role here is going to be to try to just interrupt you gentlemen, to make sure that I can get everybody a little bit equal airtime. So please, if I cut you off, don't hold it against me, and know that until we run out of time, I'll give you another chance soon. Greg, I had a specific question for you, but I also want to leave it open if you'd rather stay on that topic. I saw you jotting some notes while folks are talking, and I don't want to keep you from addressing it. The question I had to do with some discussion we did about the de minimis exemption. If you'd like to get into that, we can do that. If you'd rather continue on this topic, I'll let you choose.
Well, briefly on financial disclosure. All right, so there are regulatory exemptions, 15,000 or 25,000 or 50,000, but for some people, that's not de minimis. For other people, it is de minimis, but so would be any impact of 1% on a diversified, on a official who has widely diversified holdings. I would think that a regulatory exemption for holdings that are less than 1% of net worth, or someone of a net worth over a certain amount, or holdings that are in a diversified account, no more than 1% in a diversified account should be eligible for regulatory exemptions. I think the regulatory waivers are good as far as they go, but they don't go quite far enough. I actually think that there is not enough emphasis on recusal rather than divestiture, but that complaint I think I have more against the Senate committees than I do the Office of Government Ethics. Back to the revolving door just a minute. I mean, if the revolving door were codified, expanded the way some of these gentlemen would like it to be, we are going to not have the best and brightest and most talented and qualified individuals working in administration. And we've been down this road before. 20 years ago, President Clinton had his own post-employment executive order, and it was ballyhooed at the time. It would stop the revolving door. Well, no executive order has stopped the revolving door. You go to 1 to 2 years, why not 5 years? Why not 7 years? Why not 20 years? You're drawing lines here, and there are costs to drawing lines. Now, during the Clinton administration, Lloyd Bentsen, Leon Panetta, Phil Lader, Admiral Mikva all stated publicly that the impact of the Clinton executive order was keeping good people out of government, and President Clinton repealed the executive order in his last days in office. Now, I'm not sanguine about President Obama repealing his executive order in this last month, but I think there's a real cost there. And I really think in terms of what's healthy to democracy is to have a wide diversity in the White House, a different kind of diversity, that is talent and experience, and not simply say, okay, you never had that scarlet letter, you're good. But you had the scarlet letter once in the last 2 years, we don't want to see you. Or we'll see you, but it's over in an agency where you know nothing about.
So, Richard, I know you're a big fan of the idea of closing in on the revolving door. What do you think about that concern about recruitment? Have you had an opportunity to think about whether additional restrictions would negatively impact recruitment?
Well, you're going to have an impact on recruitment no matter what rules you have in place. Let me just visit very quickly this question about assets and I guess 208 regulatory exemptions. If someone has a $100 million portfolio, and that wouldn't be unusual in this day and age when politics appears to be the playpen of the billionaires. So you have somebody come to the administration with a $100 million portfolio, I guess 1% is $1 million. And I don't know how many of these regulatory exemptions you ought to be entitled to, but it's a pretty good rate of return on your government job. I mean, it's just from I guess I get back to the impression of the public. And what does the public think? Because there are two questions. Not just does it actually change the decision-making of the government official, which assumes that they are corrupt, which almost none are. I really do believe that. But does the public think they're corrupt? What's the public perception if you have regulatory exemptions that would apply differently to a multimillionaire? And I don't know, but I want to raise that as a legitimate concern. And the same thing with a revolving door. It's not just a question of is there undue influence on the government, but what is the public perception? And my view with respect to the revolving door is that more of the controls need to be inside the agency rather than just using criminal sanctions and the oath to try and control the people who have left the agency. There is no obligation on the part of the agency to pick up the phone and talk to the former government official on something that looks awfully similar to the same particular party matter they worked on when they were in the government. With respect to the more senior officials, the same thing, that I think we have executive order that's targeted at the agency as well as at the officials, and the agency executive order might be a little stricter. We don't want you talking to former government officials for a period of time, at least about certain topics. And there are a number of things we could do in this
If I
area.
could pick up on something you said there, Richard. Norm, we're talking about exemptions here, which for the ethics officials in the room, you know that under 18 U.S.C. 208 B1, there are individual waivers, and B2 that there are exemptions that apply no matter who you are if you meet certain criteria. Norm, Richard mentioned public perception, and I think that has proven to be an issue with regard to individual waivers as well under B1. One of the things about 208 is it's a very blunt instrument. It's very broad. It prohibits an awfully lot. I don't think anybody would think it could work if there weren't B1 and B2. And I know of at least one ethics official in our community who insists that Congress passed 208 as broadly as they did because they expected waivers to be issued. But the reality, as we've learned both with 208 and with the pledge, is that sometimes there's a negative stigma associated with waivers, as though that's the law not working as opposed to the intended aim of the law. Norm, have we suffered from unintended consequences related to that stigma, and is there a solution for it?
It seems to me that probably all of us, and those of you in the room feel this acutely, I know I felt it acutely, are more uncomfortable than we would like when it comes time to recommend or to sign a waiver. I will not soon forget the week in which I had to issue the first waivers under the Obama EO.
I remember it.
One of the things that we attempted to do was to do the waivers in a balanced way. We had one representative from business, lobbying background, and two representatives from the NGO, the nonprofit world, who we issued waivers to. And the manure was rapidly struck, the air conditioning, I will tell you. But I stood by those waivers. We issued more waivers. The Obama administration has continued to do them. There's a report that OGE does. The statutory waivers are also issued. I wish we lived in a universe in which that wasn't comfortable, but it is the important thing is that the waivers are being issued. I think the executive order, the statute are working as they should. And, you know, these are uncomfortable jobs that we have. And part of the reason we get them is because we're willing to take the incoming. So I would encourage that we all continue to do that and stick by. You can't have the flexibility of tough rules if you don't have the power to waive them. So I would recommend that the waiver provision be left in the EO.
Could I jump in here, Walter?
Sure, please.
And not
Greg.
that I'm disagreeing with Norm on the waiver issue. I want to clarify what the revolving door policy is all about of the executive order, as well as the Financial Services Conflict of Interest Act. It tends to be portrayed in a very simplistic term of prohibiting bankers from becoming the Treasury Secretary or prohibiting farmers from becoming the Secretary of Agriculture. It is nothing of the sort. We all recognize those are the people that need to fill those shoes. What these revolving door restrictions are all about is trying to manage the inherent conflicts of interest when you appoint those people into those positions. So the beauty, the absolute beauty of the ethics executive order, which is the first time any administration has ever done this, is to require, once a banker gets appointed to the Treasury Secretary position, that banker, he or she, signs an ethics pledge saying they will not take official actions that directly and substantially affect their former employer or clients. It doesn't prevent that appointment. It manages the inherent conflicts of interest. And as we've seen with the Obama Ethics Executive Order, it works.
I was going to call on Sean, but Greg, you started to talk, so feel free.
Well, you can be a CEO of a Fortune 100 company and spend weeks lobbying, but not become a lobbyist. Someone who triggers the 20%, but never goes to the cabinet, only at assistant secretary, is banned for 2 years from working in that department or agency, but not the CEO of the Fortune 100. They can be the cabinet member because they weren't a lobbyist, even when they were lobbying. You draw lines like that, there are going to be consequences, and it's not going to, I don't think, inspire the notion the public has integrity in government decision-making when lines are drawn that way.
Sean, I'm interested in your thoughts either on the revolving door or the related transparency issue. We talked with Norm about waivers. Sometimes these waivers contain very personal information, and so the waivers are either written fairly bare bones so that it can be released, but then you don't have the full explanation, or they're written in great detail, but then there's a concern about the privacy information. You had mentioned in your opening about trying to manage some of the privacy issues, both with regard to waivers and possibly, and I'm not sure if I'm sure which database you're talking about on the post-employment, but if there's a database that includes negotiations for outside employment that ultimately become unsuccessful, is POGO comfortable saying, well, there's a privacy issue there that the government shouldn't be releasing information about unsuccessful job negotiations that ultimately don't materialize? So from either of those angles or any of the others, do you see privacy issues in any of this stuff?
Well, first, I'll briefly say on the revolving door, I mean, I think goals matter. And certainly we want the best and the brightest working for our agencies, but that's not all we want. It's not just the best and the brightest, everything else be damned. We want the best and the brightest and the most ethical. We want the people who are signing up to do that job because that job is important and they're committed to it, not because potentially they're looking to feather their own nest. And the example that I would use is one that we're all familiar with, which is Flint, Michigan. Their goal there, which they were successful at, was to make water cheaper. And they did it. They didn't realize that they really should be setting a goal to make clean water cheaper. And so it's really critical that we not get too narrow in our focus as to what we're trying to accomplish or what we want from our employees. We really do need to try and see the big picture. And if it means that some people don't wind up coming into government, I honestly think that that's a payment that I'm willing to make, because the reality is people don't trust government right now. They hardly trust it at all. And the work here and the ethics order, it's all about reestablishing some of that trust. So, but on the privacy issue, it's challenging. And I know it makes people uncomfortable. In terms of the waivers, I think we have to figure out a way to have those waivers be disclosable. If that means there's 2 levels of information, a front tear sheet that gives the bare bones, and then a more detailed, because the reality is I don't want the waivers written so bare bones that people inside government, such as people in this room, don't actually have that information, so that they can then make sure that that new employee doesn't get involved in a regulatory matter or a legal matter where there might be a very clear conflict of interest. So there needs to be a lot of detail there for the agencies and the ethics officers. But I think there needs to be something that can be disclosed to the public, so the public knows what's going on and why these waivers are being issued.
So, Sean, do I understand you then to be saying that the fact of the waiver itself is fairly important, and so at least one level of comfort you might have would be with a waiver that doesn't necessarily give a lot of details as to why it was given, but at least if it's released saying it's being waived, then you know, or are you still also saying that Pogo's interested in the very detailed explanation?
I would like more than just the waivers being issued. I would like some explanation. If there is a great deal of detail in terms of employment history or activities that might be sensitive or holdings that might be sensitive, then I would understand, I don't say I would approve, but I would understand if that information was initially withheld. At the same time, if that waiver was considered controversial, then that initiates a discussion / legal proceedings, potentially to discuss whether the rest of that information should be disclosed, whether the bare bones version is sufficient or not. But for a lot of them, my guess is the bare bones would be considered sufficient.
There's currently a proposed reg. Dave, is the 2635-502 currently proposed? It's been issued? No. Okay. Well, then you'll be hearing it soon. So I can't talk about it. I thought it had been issued. Okay. Well, Sean, we'll tap you for your views on that once it's proposed. I got we're working on several, and it's hard to keep track of the state of them. Craig, you mentioned codifying some of the aspects of the pledge. Public Citizen and a number of other organizations, I think, joined them in circulating a pledge that they'd like adopted through an executive order. Does that draft include the prospect for waivers as the existing one does?
Yes, it does. What Walter is referring to is Public Citizen and a number of other groups are also waging a presidential pledge drive. This is all part of the effort to get this whole debate in the presidential election, so it gets in the public dialogue that would place this bill in a good position following the 2016 election. What the pledge drive is we've asked all presidential candidates to abide by two premises if they step into the White House. One is not to appoint anyone in government service who receives one of these golden parachutes. And the second is to require recusal of anyone appointed into the executive branch, recusal from taking official actions that affect their former employers or clients within the last 2 years. These are both the main pillars of the Financial Services Conflict of Interest Act. It can be done without legislation.
Particular matters or particular party matters?
I didn't hear.
Oh, in what kind of matter? Particular party matters only, or particular matters such as regulations that would affect the entire industry of which your former employer is a part?
It's particular matters.
Including the regulations?
Yes.
Richard, do you have a view on whether that's a distinction that you would draw and fall on one side of the line or the other, particular matters or party matters?
It includes regulations. I think you're going to have some problem. Okay, you're on the Securities Exchange Commission as one of the commissioners, and you came out of the broker-dealer industry. Sounds like you're going to have to stand down from an awful lot of stuff. I don't know how that works. I mean, with particular party matters, absolutely, I would extend 2635-502. I'd have that be a lifetime, not lifetime, but time in government on the party matters. But now the regulations, how do you do that if, I mean, how does Hank Paulson go to Treasury and not do anything that's going to affect Goldman Sachs?
The way it's always worked is if someone does not avoid an action that affects their former employer, it's if it affects their former employer directly and substantially. And the way that has been defined is if it provides a disproportionate benefit for your former employer, as opposed to affecting the entire industry as a whole.
So Goldman gets more than Morgan Stanley out of it.
But then if it's, let's say it's a certain type of business, you're regulating, Goldman has a little bit more of it than Morgan Stanley. I mean, how do you draw that line?
Well, this is the same way the ethics executive order has operated so far. We have relied heavily on the Office of Government Ethics for providing that type of guidance of trying to distinguish when any particular business or single entity receives a greater benefit than the rest of the industry as a whole. And OGE has done a good job at interpreting this. I want to also add, in drafting the Financial Services and Conflict of Interest Act, I needed the help of OGE on precisely this matter. And you guys provided consultation for me on that.
This matter or this particular matter?
So one of the things I just want to jump in and say is, I think that what you're getting at with not directly necessarily affecting your former employer, but maybe the larger industry, and it still may not be an ethical decision that a regulator might make. That's what I was trying to get at with the idea that we need more transparency as to when regulations and reports come out and there are changes and policies that are made by a particular office. That's something that we need to start making a record of and making that publicly available at the end. If you can't put your name next to the changes you made and feel that it's going to stand up to public scrutiny, then it's probably a change we don't want to see.
So along those lines on the revolving door, I think the playing field is fairly well defined in terms of the tensions that pull on the government in the two different directions. On the one hand, there's the need to avoid conflicts of interest with people coming from outside. On the other hand, there's the pull where the government needs certain expertise. And I think we see that most vividly these days in the information technology world, where the employees in this room have been deeply affected by a data breach. There are more and more sophisticated cyber attacks, and the government is hungry for expertise in the ever and fast evolving world of information technology. And there's a push to try to bring in some of the best and the brightest experts, including folks from Silicon Valley, who are currently making way too much to want to leave their careers forever and come into government and get paid what Dave Apal gets paid. But on the other hand, if we bring them in temporarily and they have an arrangement to go back to their former employer, or they come in as a special government employee where they're still working for the outside employer, we try to manage those conflicts of interest, and that presents some challenges when they're in a field that they're actively working, or they're going to be going back to be working in information technology. There's a number of other examples. I tried to find a fairly dramatic one. I'm curious just to take a poll of each of you of where you sort of fall on the spectrum of balancing the need for expertise. On the one hand, where you bring people in, they leave, they come in with expertise, but they also go back to the industry, versus the European model where you have civil servants for life and they don't have a revolving door. They never leave government, but they don't necessarily bring in outside expertise on cutting edge issues. Do you have thoughts on how to strike that balance or where else to get that information?
I would jump in on that and say that we need expertise in our government from the private sector. And that chief executive officer of a company, whether it's a Silicon Valley company or any other company, is very valuable if you can get them to come to Washington. And I would say the public confidence in chief executive officers is actually pretty high if you take out the financial services sector. So that expertise we need. What I'm afraid of is a third model where we have a revolving door in and out, but it's right here inside the Beltway. It's not chief executive officers. It's people who go out, who cross the 20% threshold. They may or may not register, and then come back into the government. A third model of an institutionalized government private sector relationship that's heavily focused on Washington, D.C., and that does not really deliver as much expertise as we need, certainly expertise in running businesses and hiring people and growing the economy, but expertise in influencing government. And that is what undermines public confidence out there in flyover country where I live.
Does anybody else have any thoughts?
Well, I'd like to address a somewhat different issue, the other regular revolving door in leaving government service and becoming a lobbyist, because that's been brought up but never quite directly addressed here. What we've seen happen, there's been a 1 year, ever since 1978, there's been a 1 year cooling off period on government officials, like members of Congress especially, moving from government service into becoming a lobbyist. It's not really that way. What it is government officials are prohibited from making a lobbying contact for 1 year. That's it. So what we've seen when we did an analysis of the revolving door in Congress, and it's a similar trend for senior executive branch officials, we've found a 43% revolving door rate. Members of Congress leave Congress, become registered lobbyists, organize lobbying campaigns, join a lobbying team, and then just have someone else on the lobbying team make the phone call. So the whole concept of trying to prevent government officials from becoming lobbyists for 1 year or 2 years is being entirely subverted unless we expand the definition of what is prohibited activity during that cooling off period. And in the Financial Services Conflict of Interest Act, we do that. Actually, former Senator Obama and Russ Feingold were working for this in the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act. And that's to include lobbying activity as well as lobbying contacts as the prohibited activity during that cooling off period. That would prevent members of Congress or executive branch officials from actually doing all the strategic consulting of a lobbying campaign for a reasonable period of time, not forever, just for 2 years would be reasonable.
So, Greg, I have a question for you. Craig, and I'm trying to really hard to articulate Greg versus Craig, which can be challenging in the bright lights. Craig mentioned the government service golden parachute, as he called it. And so this is an issue a little bit different than the lobbyist, but somebody who comes into government, perhaps in the financial services sector is the example Craig gave. And there's a lot of different ways to define that. I mean, on the one hand, there are non-discretionary payouts that you're going to get if you leave. That's one level. Another might be you're leaving, but you're forfeiting stock options or restricted stock. And the company's giving maybe a semi-discretionary payment to either accelerate or offset it, and they're not violating 209 if they pay it before you come into government. But nevertheless, there has been some negative coverage in the press of people who got accelerated payments before coming into government. And then further down the line at the other end of the spectrum, you have completely discretionary payments. And then I suppose the furthest extreme would be a contract. Craig gave the hypothetical example of somebody who has a contract that says, if you go into government, we'll give you a payment. So there's a spectrum. Do you have thoughts on where to draw the line, or if a line should be drawn at all along that spectrum?
Well, the Supreme Court decision, I think, is 30 years old on 209, saying it doesn't apply to payments before you become a federal employee. I was in the Department of Justice Civil Division going after those people civilly when the Supreme Court said, no, that you drew the line. It was not right. I've accepted that. There is discretion. Well, first of all, there's a regulation, extraordinary payments, 2-year recusals. You can always use that Section 502 to say you're going to recuse for the entire 4 years or the entire 8 years. The DOT secretary in Bush 41 said, yes, he'd worked at IBM for 15 years, so he was not going to deal with any IBM matter for the whole time he was in the cabinet. That was his decision, but there's nothing preventing a president or a White House to go to a cabinet member and say, set out for longer than the 1 or longer than the 2. But trying to draw a line on golden parachutes, platinum parachutes, silver, copper, tin, and how much? I think that the sunlight has its own reward And I would support transparency of these payments, but I wouldn't ban them. The consequence would be once you're in, if there is going to be a question about your impartiality, then you sit out after consultation with the ethics official.
I've been in the corporate and securities law field my whole professional career, and I can figure out pretty quickly what type of arrangement someone would be contractually entitled to. If you're contractually entitled to it and it's a severance payment, it is not an extraordinary payment. We're talking about payments above and beyond what you're contractually entitled to, or contracts are entered into at a time when it's known you're going to go into government service. The word is extraordinary payment under 2635-502. I call it a big goodbye present. And Emory Rounds would find these on the 278s when the nominees would fill them out. And if I saw one of those, I'd be up there with Harriet Myers and saying, we're gonna kill this nomination, or the goodbye present is going to be given back. And I don't think it's that difficult. We're talking once again about money well in excess of any severance payment that you'd be contractually entitled to upon leaving the job. And the type of people we were interviewing had plenty of money that they're contractually entitled to, and enough is enough if you want to become a government service. But that's a decision that can be made by the president with respect to the nominees. It doesn't have to be a regulatory issue. Our job as ethics lawyers is spot it, bring it to the attention of the White House, and hopefully that's taken right on upstairs to the White House counsel, and a decision is made to give it back.
So I just wanted to jump in. I mean, I'm happy that Greg is in favor of the sunlight. That's terrific. But I think part of the idea behind disclosure and starting to shed light on a very troubling pattern here of these golden parachutes is that it's supposed to inform you so that you can actually make a policy. I don't think there's a danger in drawing the lines. We need to draw the lines. If at some point we need to move the lines to the silver parachutes or what have you, then you make that adjustment. But the idea that the sunlight by itself, and I'm a huge proponent of sunlight. I've worked on it for 12 years. But to say that that's it, that's all we have to do, and it will cure all our ills, it's an overstatement, unfortunately.
My experience would reinforce that. The strategy that we used in the White House was to have the tough rules, to build in some flexibility by having the waivers, to have the waivers be transparent. I just checked. They're all still there on the White House website. You can see every waiver we've given, and they continue to be given at regular intervals. And to reinforce that whole package with a strong transparency wrapper, including through the White House visitor records policy, so everybody can evaluate whether the door is revolving or not. None of those is perfect. But like it or not, when you're in a rule of law system, all you do is draw lines. You live on the slippery slope. That's where we all are. That's all the hardest questions that we deal with all day long. When I was in my law firm, I'd complain about some of the problems I had to solve for my clients. We had a saying, well, if it was easy, Schlabotnik would do it. That's why we have the system. And by the way, the alternatives to a rule of law based democracy also involve hard line drawing by small concentrations of powerful individuals or by a monarch and his court. So I think these kinds of rule-based systems with flexible judgments wrapped by a lot of transparency are the way to go in designing ethics systems. And indeed, as I've traveled, worked abroad, and advised foreign governments, that's the basic structure that I advocate to them. It is very hard and painful to do that from inside the system. People don't like the tough rules applying to them. People give you a lot of grief when you grant waivers. The transparency is very, very uncomfortable. When I remember, Walt, when we put the personal financial disclosures, the 278s, we made them electronically available. You no longer had to, many of you will remember this, for the White House, you no longer had to request them by fax or pick up a hard copy from OGE. You could simply email us, make clear that you met the statutory criteria to obtain it, and we would send you in pretty quick order, the 278s. The howls of outrage by the people who said, "Why is my information on the internet?" That was a tough afternoon, but it's the right way to go.
By the way, when it comes to the lobbyist waivers, there have been 4 lobbyist waivers offered by the administration in the course of the ethics executive order. And all 4 of them came in the first year of the ethics executive order. And I'm going to tell a little story about how it happened. This is my interpretation. Maybe Norm knows better than I. But the transition team for Obama wasn't quite paying attention to the ethics executive order. And they ended up recommending William Lynn be appointed Deputy Director of Defense, and Obama did that. It turns out William Lynn had been a lobbyist right to that day for Raytheon, and that would directly violate the ethics executive order. And many of us were just, screaming, to the heavens, come on, what's going on here? And Obama issued a waiver for Lynn the next day. And then non-profit lobbyists were complaining as well. Well, how come we can't get appointed? And so Obama ended up waiving the restriction against 3 nonprofit lobbyists that were then appointed. So those 4 happened in the first year, and after that, it settled down.
Yeah, I don't think that's right, Craig. I'm looking at the website now. I won't comment on the internal discussions in the administration. I will say that the decision to have a balanced set of waivers early on that addressed both a for-profit lobbyist and some nonprofit lobbyists was not something the administration stumbled into. There was a need. Bill Lynn was the best person for the job at the Department of Defense, and Jocelyn Fry and Cecilia Munoz, Cecilia is still there, were the right people for their White House jobs. I'm looking at the long list of names in terms of how many ethics waivers were issued. At least the one for the Deputy Assistant to the President and Senate Liaison, one of the internal White House lobbyists, I think he had been a lobbyist previously, and that was a lobbying-based waiver. My eyes aren't good enough to read the fine print of all the waivers on my small screen, but they are all there listed. I think there have been others after the first year.
So hold on one second. We're going to wrap up in 1 second. Greg's been hitting the buzzer over here, so I'm going to let him get a word in. I do think Norm is right that in that case, the waiver was issued prospectively, not retroactively. I think, though, it is a good example of the stigma we talked about associated with waivers, because Craig is right that there was a lot of media attention to those waivers, and that certainly created a lot of news. But I believe it was prospective. We're at 3. We'll go a minute and a half over so that you can get in each of you a quick last word, since you were hitting
Very
the buzzer,
quick.
and then I have one last thing.
This is maybe not to this audience, but the audience outside this room. Then the question is not the Obama executive order and nothing. It's the Obama executive order drawing the lines it draws, and 18 U.S.C. section 208 and 207 and 209 and the lines that they draw. I submit that system worked, and the impression the public has about the dysfunction of government has zero relationship to the Obama executive order.
So Richard, really quickly,
we need
buzzing.
we need transparency in this government. We need a lot more of it. I'll give you an example. We need to know what our public officials are doing with their time. I have here my calendar, and you can have it if you want. Speak at OGE conference, fly back to Minnesota, and pick up son at a basketball game. If someone is bailing out banks or regulating banks or deregulating banks, or I don't know, whatever they do on the taxpayer's dollar, we ought to be able to get that information about who they're meeting with and what's happening in our government. And we need more transparency. So I applaud the administration for taking some steps forward on this, but we need a lot more, and that's what the people expect.
So we're out of time. I wish we could keep these guys going another hour. It's been a lot of fun. We had some levity today, but these are extremely serious issues. And I think the one thing they would all agree on is that we'd really like whichever is the next administration to put some serious thought into what their ethics policy will be. There's experts here on this panel you can consult. At OGE, we worked with Norm on the pledge, and we're certainly able to provide you that, the experience we bring, lessons learned, things we can do. If you contact us, we can work with you on whatever policy or provide you technical assistance. But I want to thank our panelists. I promised you this was a good group. They definitely are. I've enjoyed working with every one of them, not only in this panel, but in all of the other interactions we've had over the years. I hope you enjoyed them today. Enjoy your break.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. After such a fascinating panel, we have the honor of two of the panelists joining us now, Ambassador Norm Eisen and Mr. Richard Painter. Thank you for being part of the panel, and thank you for joining us now for this interview.
Thank you.
And welcome.
Happy to be here.
Great. Ambassador Eisen, you mentioned during the panel that the tone is really set from the top. And yesterday we had a session about presidential transition, and Clay Johnson and Lisa Brown mentioned that it's never too early to really start with the transition. Do you have any advice for the campaigns that, anything they can do to set an ethical tone now that can, further go on throughout the transition and then ultimately in their administration if they're successful?
I had the fortunate experience of working, assisting, and consulting on the campaign of then Senator Obama, my law school classmate. I've known him for a quarter of a century. And so I saw firsthand how important it is to have a strong position and a strong tone on ethics matters from the very beginning. My advice to the campaigns of every political orientation would be to think about the ethics component broadly construed of the transition. And voters want to hear early that you'll have an administration of integrity, that you'll take strong positions on other issues that are part of the ethics world broadly written, such as lobbying, regulation, campaign finance reform, transparency. So speak out early and often. We did in the Obama campaign in 2007 and 2008. And I think the American people responded to that, and it gave us a good footing to move into the actual transition in the White House.
Mr. Painter, do you think it's too early, or if not, what advice would you give the campaigns?
I would call on all of the candidates to run an ethical campaign. If you want to be president, convince us now that you know how to run an ethical campaign to be president. Tell the truth. Identify the problems that confront our country and identify solutions. Don't blame those problems on entire races and religions of people. Focus on the issues, not the attack ads, not scapegoating, and commit yourself to ethics in government. Commit yourself to the executive order that is currently in place, or to revising it appropriately, but not backtracking on ethics. We need a government that is independent of special interest influence, and the candidates need to show us specifically how they're going to do that if they want to be president.
Thank you. Mr. Painter, you highlighted the importance of public confidence in the integrity of our government. And Ambassador Eisen, you also mentioned that this administration has been less plagued by scandal. However, there have been several recent articles about the public's lack of confidence in the integrity and trustworthiness of our government. So what advice would you give the new administration on how they can improve public confidence?
Well, shall I go first?
Sure.
First, I'd like to say how encouraging it is, the emphasis on ethics, both on the technical legal rules and the larger spirit of integrity and decency that my friend and colleague Richard advocates. I completely 100% plus agree with, and I think you have a Republican and a Democrat sitting here who have wholehearted concurrence. So there is hope for bipartisanship in America. Now, moving to the question, it seems to me that it's absolutely critical that the administration, the future administration, whoever it may be, start work on these matters and follow it up. I would certainly point to the importance of demanding the highest standards of compliance. I'm confident that whichever administration takes office will, I hope, continue the ethics executive order, and you've got to have great people.
Mr. Pena?
I would urge the new president to focus on campaign finance reform as a number one priority. The Citizens United case has been a disaster. There is more we could do as well. Individuals ought to have the right to have some small portion of their tax dollars contributed to the political campaign of their choice. We need to bring in small donors. This has become a very serious issue, and it's a national security issue because we have more and more global corporate wealth that is going to be influencing our government. So campaign finance reform is the number one priority. I would also urge the new president to expand the authority and the budget of the Office of Government Ethics, the ethics agents, offices, and the agencies. This is money well worth spending to protect the integrity of our government against influences, undue influences, foreign and domestic.
And we have to wrap up, but quickly, could you give any advice to ethics officials, like the ones watching now, what they can do for the new administration and setting an ethical tone and improving public confidence?
Ignore the absolute foolishness of this political campaign and just try and do your job between now and next January.
Ambassador Eisen?
As always, to my colleagues in the federal ethics community, be tough, be strong, be courageous as you are, and be ready to defend the principles and the values that maintain the integrity of our democracy. And I would thank them in advance for doing that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Well, stay tuned. Next, we're going to have the session on travel and gifts, so stay tuned for that. And thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
thank Richard, Norm, and Sean here for their contribution, and curse them for being such a hard act to follow. All right. My name's Dave Apol. I'm the General Counsel at the Office of Government Ethics. Lenny's going to introduce himself because he just does everything better than I do. But at any rate, we are going to be talking about the travel rules. If you are here for Lenny's regular presentation, you know, get used to being disappointed. We're not going to cover everything Lenny usually does. Oh, good, no exodus. We're going to focus on the travel rules and travel issues that that you really need to focus on in the next year and a half. Those issues that are most likely to cause you problems or keep you employed, whichever way you want to look at it, during the next year and a half. I'm going to start, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lenny. I'm going to talk about some issues that really aren't covered by the federal travel regulations, but are travel-related issues that that you need to be thinking about, or that you're going to be thinking about because they're going to be presented to you in the next year and a half or so. And there's three things I'm going to start by talking about political travel in the upcoming year. There is a campaign going on, and you're going to get to the point where some of your principals or some of your political appointees who are allowed to be actively involved in politics under the Hatch Act are going to be taking political travel or going to be going to the convention. And we're going to talk a little bit about the rules that apply to that vis-a-vis travel. And then Lenny's going to talk, and one of the things that I'm going to chime in on is the other issue, which that in my experience, one always bumps into with new employees. At least one of your primary appointees are going to want to maintain their home back in their home state. And that tends to raise travel issues for you. And we'll talk a little bit about those. So let's get started on the campaign-related travel. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. Chris Swartz and I will be talking about this a little bit more in the gift section that for tomorrow, where we're going to be talking about the new gift rules, and as well as gifts as related to transition. I mean, obviously, when an employee goes on a campaign trip, when your secretary or principal is out campaigning for the Democratic or Republican candidate, one is more likely than the other in this particular administration, I suppose. But when one of your people are out campaigning, that obviously is not official activity, and official funds cannot be used to pay for that trip. With one little nuance, just like with the G1 exception, well, let's not tie to the G1, that just confuses things. But if there's a security detachment or someone has an official duty to go on that trip to provide security or something like that, that can be official travel for that person. But the person who's out there doing campaign work obviously has to be paid with personal funds. They can be paid they can be paid with campaign funds if the person is authorized to accept that, which is usually the case. Of course, if that were the rule, if that were the simple rule, we wouldn't have any problems. But what's going to happen is one of two things. They're going to be out on a campaign trip, and the regional office or and someone in the office is going to say, "Oh, while you're out there, won't you meet with our regional office, or there's a company out there we need to meet with, or there's a plant you should take a look at." And I mean, the easiest thing to say in that case is no. Once you start mixing campaign travel with official travel, it gets complicated, and that makes my job harder. Well, that actually is not. How hard this makes your job is not what motivates your principal to make decisions. And also, if in fact there is important official work to be done out there, that can be done in connection with the campaign trip. It may well be very supportive of the mission of the agency to be doing that. And then you have what we call a mixed trip. Now, here, what rules apply is going to depend on who the campaign is for. If it's for a presidential candidate, one rule applies, and if it's for non-presidential candidates, a different rule applies. The rule that you'll find in the Hatch Act at 734-503 is called the hard time rule. Every time I had to apply it, I remembered the old Carter's family song, hard times come again no more, because you really don't want to deal with this. It's a real pain. But the hard time rule, and you'll have a handout at the end of the class that I'm going to pass out later because I don't want you following along, because I wanted the illusion that I was actually covering more material than I was. The hard time rule basically says you divide the total activity time by the amount of time spent on political activity, and the campaign has to pay for that proportional share of the trip. Lots of complications to it, and it's really not an OGE rule to enforce. You can look it up at 734, 5 CFR 734-503. For example, if you are paying for a speaker system at one location, the entire cost of that speaker system is attributed to that location rather than being distributed. So there's lots of variations to it, but essentially you take how much time you spent doing campaign activity, compare that to how much time was spent doing the total amount of time spent on activity, and that would be time spent on both campaign and official activity, and you pay a proportional share. The concept is fairly simple. The implementation never is. But that is the rule. The reason it's called the hard time rule, and this may be counterintuitive, they had to choose one way or another. You don't take the proportion amount of, the only time you're computing on is the hard time, and that is the time you're actually doing the activity. So obviously, most time that you're spent on travel is spent getting to and from where you're going. That doesn't count into the time calculation, just the time that the actual activity was done. And that's the proportion. If it's a presidential travel, then it's going to be governed by the presidential, under the FEC rules, and they apply what's called the hypothetical trip rule. And the hypothetical trip rule is basically the campaign pays for what it would have cost to get the person there and back and keep him there or her there for as long as he was doing it. And if there are any additional costs associated with the official activity, the government can pay only those additional costs. Let's just contrast these two. It's $1,000 to travel to Los Angeles to do a speaking engagement, to go to Los Angeles, and it's another $1,000 for all the other incidental costs involved. So the whole trip costs $2,000. He's going to stay there 2 days. First day he's going to do campaign activity. The second day he's going to do official activity. It's $500 for a cost for each day. So you got $2,000 total expense. Under the hard time, and he spends an hour doing each, or he's hardworking. He spends 3 hours doing each. Okay, so under the hard time rule, how much he spent 3 hours doing political activity. There was 6 hours of total activity, so half the trip has to be paid for by the campaign. $1,000 is paid for by the campaign. That's the hard time rule. Okay. Of course, it will never be that easy. And the hypothetical trip rule, however, it's different, right? It was $1,000 to get there. It was $500 to stay the first day. He spent $500 extra to stay the second day so he could do official trip. Under the hypothetical trip rule, if it was for a presidential campaign, the campaign would pay $1,500 and the government would only pay $500. Everyone understand the distinction between those two? Hopefully you'll never have to use it because in the larger agencies, hopefully you can push this off on someone else, but you do need to watch for this. These payments have to be repaid in a reasonably quick period of time. And what is reasonably quick? Well, you want them paid before your congressional committee asks about them, because they do. This is a favorite for them. So make sure your people understand that rule as to political travel. Okay. All right. Now, many of your folks may also be interested in attending the nominating conventions coming up. The White House has put out a memo on that on June 25th, 2012. I've talked to the White House counsel's office. There will be another one coming out, but for now, they don't anticipate it changing a lot from the January 2012 memo. And that memo, again, nothing surprising there. When you attend a political convention, you're attending in your personal capacity. And so you can't use your title, you can't use your subordinates, you can't use government resources to get you there or to support you there. Again, security details, things like that, can be traveling in official capacity. Now, let's say, and you're not actually a political convention, you're not actually conducting campaign activity. So we're not using the hard time rule here. But let's say the Chamber of Commerce, for example, says, whoa, lots of important people are going to be in town when this political convention takes place. This is a great time for us to hold a meeting to talk to all these political people and all the important people. We're going to hold one in both conventions. And they say, would you like to come down for our meeting? Those of you who have tight budgets, that's all of you, the eyes of the budget keeper may light up at this point and say, hey, I can use 1353 travel for this. If they want my person to come down and speak to that event, we can do 1353 travel to get them down there. Well, actually, your budget people shouldn't be concerned about this. Your principal may say, I just as soon not pay for this myself, so I'll do it under 1353 travel. Assume it's legitimate 1353 travel. Assume that this is an event that you think it's worth your person going to. Don't do that. The White House memo says it should be assumed that the primary purpose of this trip is political, and the campaign or you should pay for it. Similarly, we have a regional office down there. I'm going to visit the regional office down there. Very generous of you. Don't think do not have the government pay for that trip, even if you're going to be conducting some official activity down there. Because normally, for personal business, if you had personal business someplace and you had a legitimate reason for being there, you'd pay the additional cost. Don't use that here. The White House understands that might be arguably supportable, but makes clear that that's a really bad idea, and they don't want their people doing that. And if the person is either a political appointee or a less restricted employee under the Hatch Act, and if you went to the Hatch Act seminar, you know what that means. If you didn't go to the Hatch Act seminar, you probably still know what that means. If you're less restricted, that means not an SES or in certain agencies, you could accept travel expenses from the campaign as well without violating the Office of Government Ethics gift rules. You could also pay for that if you were providing. You could also pay for the trip yourself, of course. Just be a little careful if you're doing duties or if your person's doing work for the campaign. That may be problematic because the payment of the expenses could be a campaign contribution, and that's limited. So just alert your folks to that possibility. Now, these conventions, as you know, are very, very packed with business and very little free time for parties and things like that at the conventions. But just assume that there might be a party or something like that going on at the convention. Can your person attend that party? Well, basically, you have to see whether you can use any of the gift exemptions, and obviously the one that leaps to mind is the widely attended gathering. But obviously, if the event is less than $20. They can use that one. They can use the Hatch Act exemption if it's paid for by a political party. The host committee is not a political party, but if it's paid for by a political entity and they're providing services, they can use the Hatch Act exemption to the gift rule. But most of these we're going to be thinking widely attended gathering. And traditionally, the White House has determined or made a call that government employees may attend these events. This White House has made the call that government employees can attend those events using the widely attended gathering exception, unless the widely attended gathering is sponsored by a lobbyist organization, in which case the Obama gift ban will apply. So those are three areas, travel-related areas, that you may be facing in the upcoming year. And the most likely ones you're going to be facing. But then we get into the travel questions that are going to come up once we're into the transition period. And I'm going to let Lenny talk about what authorities there are for payment of travel during the transition period.
Thanks, Dave. I just want to mention, addressing some of what Dave just mentioned. My name is Lenny Lowentree, by the way. I'm the Deputy General Counsel over at GSA, for those of you who do not know me. For the portion of travel where there's a mixed event, in order for an agency to reimburse an employee for a portion of the official travel, they're going to have to be on orders for that portion. For example, for meals and lodgings, if half the trip is for official purposes, that will have to be annotated. And then a determination will have to be made. Why did you have to travel to that TDY location? Was it because of the official nature of the trip, for which the agency may or may not pay the transportation to the TDY station, or was it to attend the political event? So that determination will have to be made by the agency in order to reimburse the employee or to pay for the transportation. So you have to be cognizant of that. What Dave asked me to talk about a little bit is what about folks who come into Washington to work on the presidential transition? Are they entitled to travel reimbursement for any portion of those transition duties that they perform on the behalf of the presidential transition team? And the answer is generally no. They're not federal employees. They're not covered by Title V, 5 U.S.C. 5702, and those provisions of the statute that apply to reimbursement of federal employees. So to the extent that an individual who performs any kind of travel for the presidential transition, GSA as an agency historically, for the last, 40 years or so, Laura, has received an appropriation from Congress in the neighborhood of $7 or $8 million to pay for transition team activities. That includes space, that includes equipment, supplies, IT, telecommunications, and reimbursement for travel that's necessary for carrying out the purposes of the presidential transition. But they are not on travel orders and they're not on official duty travel. So one, they don't have access to the city pairs when they're performing transition travel. They do not receive the benefit of a government vehicle. They're not considered employees. They will likely not be covered under the Federal Tort Claims Act because they're not performing official government travel purposes, even though they'll get reimbursed for rental of a vehicle for transition duties. They do not have access to GSA fleet vehicles. So there's very limited, and as Dave indicated, there may be folks who are associated with the presidential transition, such as security, the Secret Service. They're on official duty, they're on official travel, they're performing official functions. They will be put on official travel orders and reimbursed for their travel expenses, but those are very limited and do not apply to the normal transition duties. There is one exception that's by statute, and that is for folks who work on the presidential transition and then relocate to an area, usually Washington, but it may be in one of the regions. Having worked on the presidential transition, they now get appointed to a position. Can they get reimbursed for relocation? And what the statute provides and the regulations provide is that if an employee has worked on the presidential transition and within the same fiscal year that they get appointed to a position in the federal government, the government can pay limited relocation expenses once that a person has been appointed to the position and signs the 1 year commitment to stay in government service for at least 1 year or 3 years, depending on what the term limit is going to be. So what they get for their relocation, they don't get the real estate transaction. They don't get per diem for the family. They don't get house hunting trips. So there's a limit to what that official will receive once he or she becomes appointed to an agency. They'll get transportation of that for themselves and their family members to the new duty station. They'll get per diem expenses for the employee. Household goods shipment and temporary storage is all they're going to get, not real estate transactions. So it is limited. We get questions sometimes about, well, what about if an agency has to prepare an employee for hearings, one that has been nominated to a position within that agency? The agency can issue invitational travel orders to brief that nominee, and can also pay to have them come to Washington for those hearings under invitational travel orders, because they're not yet employees, so they have to be put under invitational travel orders. But that is a limited authority to pay for officials who are appointed and have to be briefed and have to come for hearings to Washington. Okay, so those are really the limited travel authorities for presidential transition officials. Any questions on that? No? All right, there's one here. Yeah, you'll find, well, they're not in the travel regs. The question is, can you find the answers to these in the federal travel regs? And the answer is, with TDY travel, no. You're going to have to look at the presidential transition, or you will call my office, and I'll give you the name. Oh, he's going to hate this, but I'll give you the name of the attorney. We have GSA, as I told you, is responsible for providing the administrative support for the presidential transition, and we do have an attorney. His name is Seth Greenfeld. That's assigned to it. And if you have questions, you certainly can call our office and ask him if you have that kind of a question, because it is not covered in the FTR. And by the way, his number is 202-501-2200. And I'll mention that I mentioned that if there's a question. In terms of the relocation, there is a provision for appointees, and that's in section 41 CFR is where you'll find the federal travel regs, and it's section 302-3.5. And it does discuss the relocation of presidential appointees who've worked on the presidential transition. Okay, that's the one provision in the FTR that cover that. Okay, anything else? Okay, what Dave asked me to do is to cover some more of the general. That I think we've covered a lot of the things that are unique for transition, but these will apply across the board. Dave, you wanted to?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about, there's a couple ones that you are going to be drawn into probably. If they probably belong technically to someone else, but ethics officials seem to get drawn into them a lot. And the first is if you've got a situation where the person has not yet moved his home to Washington, D.C. A typical, that's not our problem, but it is your problem, because that person's is going to want to go back home, and he's going to want to go back home frequently. The easy case is, let's say he lives in Boston and he wants to fly home on the weekends. He certainly can do that, or she can do that, and he or she does it on their own dime. This is personal travel. A related issue that that you're gonna face is how does he get to the airport? Can someone pick him up? Can he be taken to the airport? That's going to depend on whether he's got portal-to-portal trip privileges. May well depend on your security office's call as to whether security is needed. My hunch is that if a person has portal-to-portal authority, that is, that they get driven to work every morning, then most likely they're also going to have a security detachment that can take them to the airport. It's an issue that you're going to need to work out with your travel office, but you're going to be the first one that's going to be asked this question: Can I be driven to the airport or not? And although normally for most employees, of course, you don't drive them to the airport to go on personal business. For these folks, there may be some authority to do it. And you, before just saying no, because that's the general rule, check out the portal-to-portal authorities that they may have and talk to your security office. The security office often will say, we want to take that person to the airport. We don't want him or her wandering around the airport on their own. Although they're going to be wandering around in Boston, but I guess it's a friendlier town. But at any rate, that's the easy one. He's going to travel to and from his home. He's going to do that on his own dime. And the only question that's going to come up is, what about getting to and from the airport? Now, we've had cases in the past, and keep good records of that. But we've had cases in the past where it just seems like all of a sudden there's a disproportionate amount of official business going on in the secretary or the principal's home city. You know, and lo and behold, someone is finding that these are worthwhile events to go to every week, and they probably are. Looked on, you know, go meet with the regional office or go meet with the local chamber of commerce, and you'll be able to point to other chamber or similar events in other cities the person goes to. You just got to be able to defend, and he or she is going to have to be able to defend why there's so many events in Boston. And my strong recommendation is you don't want to defend that. He should not be doing a whole bunch of official events in Boston if that's disproportionate to the amount of events he's doing in other similar cities. The problem may arise that, well, I'm doing official events in Boston because I'm in Boston, you know. But in that case, I would still say the best bet there would be, okay, you're in Boston on personal business, so you'll pay for that on personal business. The travel, you know, there's an old joke, and I haven't told it yet this conference, and I just see there's just an emptiness since I haven't told this joke yet. But there's an old joke about a guy's walking down the road, and he sees this person standing under, it's a snowy night, and there's this guy by the lamppost who's just frantically searching for something. And the guy is a good guy. He walks over and says, "What you looking for?" He says, "Well, I dropped my keys." He says, "That's terrible. Let me help you look." And they search for about an hour, and they don't find the keys. And he says, "Are you sure you dropped the keys here?" And the guy says, "Oh, no, I dropped them over there." "Well, why are you looking for them over here?" And the guy says, "Well, because the light's better here." I don't know if we have any IGs in the room, but newspaper reporters or whatever. You know, newspapers and people looking for problems don't necessarily look where the most significant problems are going to be. They look where the light is good. And there ain't any better light for finding scandals than travel records. I mean, they show exactly what people are doing and where they're going, and it's all spelled out. It's really easy to find violations in the travel area. So it's a favorite place for congressional folks, press reporters, IGs to look. And when your person is making a disproportionate amount of trips to a disproportionate amount of official trips to their hometown, they're gonna, the political opponents, the newspapers, they're gonna find that, and it's gonna be all right there. And indeed, every agency as I've been at, I've had a FOIA request for please give me all the travel to all the travel by the secretary, and it's and almost always there's a disproportionate amount of trips to the home state. Fortunately, The reason there's a disproportionate amount of trips, they asked for his calendar, and both the personal travel and the official travel is on there. And so that's why there's a disproportionate amount, because he's taken 5 trips to Boston on his own dime, and you can explain that. And hopefully you can explain that before they run the story. That's, they're going to be looking for that, and they're going to find it. So if you get pushback on this, and you might, which is, well, I have a legitimate reason to go to Boston, don't let it, make your warning. And if he still goes to Boston a whole bunch of times on official time, he's, you've at least warned him that it's almost inevitable that that's going to result in a bad story and probably an investigation. All right. So we talked about personal travel back to the home state, not problematic. We've talked about official travel back to the home state, frequently problematic. And then there's the third time, and this is where it gets tricky, and I'm going to turn it over to Lenny, because this one's hard. And that is, what do you do where the employee, let's take our Boston guy, let me give you a hypothetical, travels up to Boston on Friday. He needs to be, his place of business is Washington, D.C. I mean, his duty station is Washington, D.C. But he goes to Boston on Friday, and he needs to be in London on Monday. How does he get there? Can you let him fly from Boston? Does any adjustment need to be made? Now, think about that. Now assume that he lives in Los Angeles. Does that change the answer to that question? And I'm going to let Lenny answer that, because it's too hard for me.
Yeah. Although I just wanted to mention one thing Dave mentioned: travel and the misuse of a government motor vehicle. Those are the 2 areas that seem to get the most attention. And of course, here I am from GSA, and we had that Western Regions Conference fiasco in Las Vegas about six years ago now, I guess, 6, 7, and it's still casting a large shadow over my agency.
Really, because we haven't noticed that shadow.
Travel and conferences. Well, it does, and so it's not something that goes away, and it affected virtually every agency, as many of you know. We don't even call this a conference anymore. We call this a summit, so no, it really has impacted. So this is the area. I told Dave, you can make a $10 million error on a contract, and it doesn't gain any traction. But if you misuse travel or misuse a government vehicle for some reason, and it's always been that way, and you have folks on the Hill. When I first came to GSA, it was Senator Proxmire, who was a real, for those of you might remember, and Senator Grassley is a big proponent of ensuring that there's no misuse of government funds for that, as well as many other members. So that is. But to answer your question about routing of travel. The FTR does anticipate and gives agency the discretion to route travel either from the duty station or from other location. And what it says is travel, what is routing travel is by the usually traveled route unless your agency authorizes a different route as officially necessary. And for those of you who want the site, it's the FTR section 301-10.7. And what that does, it gives discretion to agencies to determine what's officially necessary. So in the examples that Dave gave, if you're going overseas and you live in Boston and you work at your permanent duty station is in Washington, the agency could make a determination that for the efficiency of the agency, it's more effective and more efficient to actually route the travel from the individual's home to the TDY station and either back to their home or back to their permanent duty station. And again, they'd have to, and once you make the determination that that's the official routing, even from California, you make that determination, and it's not necessarily more expensive to fly from California than it is from Boston. And once you make the determination as what's officially necessary, and you put that individual on official travel orders, they are eligible to use the city pairs contract. Okay, that's what determines the availability of the contract city pairs. So if you're just merely using a city that you happen to be at for your own personal vacation or something, and the agency doesn't want to have you travel from that vacation spot or other location, it's now going to behoove you to get your permanent duty station, and you're not permitted to use the airline city pairs to get to that permanent duty station. But the agency has the discretion to route the travel from the home, from another TDY location, even a vacation spot, if the travel was necessary and it was not anticipated when you began the travel. So there is a lot of discretion on how you route travel, okay? Any questions on routing? Okay. They've also asked me to talk about a little bit about premium class travel. And those of you who've been to my travel presentations, probably you know this pretty much by heart, but he asked me to go over it and some other things that might be of interest, both for new folks that are coming in and for senior level and any other. So when can you use a first class and when can you use a business class accommodation on an airline? And there are 4 exceptions to the rule that you normally have to fly on a coach class accommodation. The first exception for first class is if there's no coach seat available within 24 hours of travel. So if you have to travel, we're not going to ask, and the only coach seat available is 2 days before or 2 days after you end your TDY, we don't expect you to wait around. The agency can authorize, and this is not entitlements, this is where the agency can authorize the use of a first class accommodation if you're going to have to wait around more than 24 hours for a coach seat. Accommodate a disability or special need. To accommodate a disability is not necessarily agency discretion. If an employee has a doctor's certification, a medical certification, that the use of first class is medically necessary, the agency has to make that accommodation, okay? And then you're eligible to fly first class. And if you have an attendant that flies with you, that travels with you, that attendant can also fly on first class, okay? So it applies to both. Doesn't do any good to have the employee who needs the attendant in one class of service and someone flying in a different class of service back in the aircraft. A special need is a little different. A special need is not a medical need. It's actually the size of the employee. We had, this arose, it's got to be now 15, 20 years ago at GSA. We had an official at GSA, a high-level official who's just too large to fit in a coach seat accommodation. And he said, he came down, he said, look, I need to have an upgrade to first class. I don't fit in a coach seat accommodation. And we said, well, you have to get a medical certification that it's medically necessary. And he said, but Len, it's not, I don't have a medical condition. I'm just, and it was obvious. He was a big guy and he was about 7 feet tall and a large guy. So we realized we had a deficiency in the FTR. We amended the FTR to include special need, and that's intended to cover someone who can't be accommodated in a coach seat. Sometimes we get questions, well, how about instead of upgrading to first class, can we book two coach seats? And of course, the answer is yes. And usually that's cheaper. So if you have that question, got a question back there? Yes, it has to be a medical certification. It has to include the necessity, that there is a necessity, a medical necessity, the duration, and the recommendation that the person be given first class or business class accommodation. The duration, some are lifetime, and it can say lifetime in that way. Otherwise, it has to be repeated each year if it's temporary. Well, okay, the question is, what if it says we recommend as opposed to saying this person needs it? I would go back to the employee to say, is it medically necessary or is it not medically necessary? That's what the regulation provides. If it's just for comfort, it might not. So that is going to behoove the travel approving official asking more questions and maybe referring it to an individual at the agency at the medical, if you have a medical attendant at the agency, and a lot of us do, the uniform services, to ask for additional information. But it has to specify that it is necessary to accommodate the disability, not just recommended as an accommodation, okay? The next exception, the third exception for first class, is for security requirements. If the agency determines that the security of the employee or property, government property, such as a pouch, diplomatic pouch, if it provides more security in first class, and they're going to have to figure out why first class provides more security, but nevertheless, that is an exception. Protective detail, if someone is a high-level official that has a first class for security reasons, and they have protective detail, of course, the security officer also can be authorized first class to be able to protect that official.
Lenny, do you see that very often? Because I mean, I had that situation at my agency, and I was because the security official will always say, well, yeah, I can do a better job securing him in business class than if we're both sitting.
No, we don't see it too often, but if you're a cabinet member that has high visibility and you don't have government aircraft at your disposal, yeah, you'll see that. And remember, all first class and business class is reported. It goes, it's reported to Congress and to OMB, so it gets visibility. So agencies, and we have a fourth exception, and that is required for agency mission. So if the determination is made that flying first class would enhance the agency's mission, the agency can authorize an upgrade to first class. And the kind of examples are, if you have to fly through the night and be prepared to carry out the mission of the agency the following morning, they may want you arrested if you have to meet with diplomats, heads of state or so. They don't want you half asleep when you arrive. So if you don't have a rest stop, for example, if it's over 14 hours, they may authorize first class if it enhances the agency mission. If you have to prepare, for example, for a presentation and there's not enough room in a coach seat availability, the agency could authorize an upgrade to first class. Business class, there are several more exceptions for business class. Some of them are duplicative of the first class. What do you got a question?
They got a question back there?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so the question is, if it's a canceled flight and the airline agrees to upgrade you at no additional cost to first, that's not the use of appropriated funds, and there will be no objection. If the airline puts you on a first class to get you on the next flight, for example, to meet the mission of your travel, no objection. It's not a government expense, and that sort of goes to another question that we get frequently, and can I use my personal points to upgrade to first class or my own funds to upgrade to first class? The answer is yes. There's no objection to it. It's not additional cost to the government. So if you have frequent flyer points that you want to apply to a trip to upgrade to business or first class, no objection. And there's a little note in the FTR that states that, because it was continuous. We would get questions. How about the use of my own resources? Can I upgrade to first class? Before 1996, the rule was no, you couldn't because of an appearance. But then OMB and GAO and GSA got together and we finally changed it in 96. So you can use your own. Any other questions on first class? Okay. On business class, some of them are duplicative, disability, special needs, security. Inadequate sanitation is an exception for an upgrade to business class. And what we mean by that is in undeveloped, lesser developed countries, sometimes they have animals in coach seats. They have livestock, not in coach seats, in the coach cabin. And, we've gotten requests from the three agencies that do most international travel: agriculture, DOD, and state. And they asked for that exception back in the early 80s, I guess. And they ask again in recent years to maintain that exception because of inadequate sanitation. It's not overflowing toilets. It is where generally where there's livestock or chickens in coaches, and that's where they store it. They put it back in some of these. There's some regularly scheduled airlines that only have business class accommodations. Of course, if that's the only airline available, you can upgrade to business class. And then one that we get questions on frequently is, what about if a non-federal source gives you a ticket and gives you a ticket for a business class accommodation? That is an exception in and of itself. So if a non-federal source offers you offers a federal employee who's attending a meeting or similar function a business class ticket, the agency can accept that business class ticket so long as they're offering it to others, that they're not trying to just ingratiate the federal employee by only offering it to that one individual. But as long as that's what they're offering to others, that in and of itself is an exception, that, the employee can be upgraded to business class. The one that's probably most frequently used is the 14-hour rule. And there was some discussion about eliminating that. If the flight from legs up to the final wheels down is in excess of 14 hours, including any connect, the agency has the discretion, it's not an entitlement, to authorize an upgrade to business class, or in lieu of a business class accommodation, a rest stop, either during the trip or at the destination, okay? So sometimes we get questions, well, what about the hour and a half it takes me to get to the airport? Can I count that? No, can't count that. What about the 2 hours or 3 hours that I have to get there in advance to go to security? Can I count that? And the answer is no. It's wheels up to final destination, wheels down. That's what the criteria is for a business class upgrade, okay? It's funny, there's a trip that goes from Washington to Beijing that I think is something like 13 hours and 52 minutes.
13:52, yep.
Is that right?
Yep.
You don't know how many people opt to choose the flight that takes 14 hours and about 45 minutes as opposed to it, so that they can get the upgrade.
So just, and this, actually, I noticed that there's been a change in, or a clarification on the 14-hour rule, where it says you can use the 14-hour rule if you're required to report to duty the following day.
Right.
That's a clarification from what it used to say.
Well, again, it was never an entitlement, Dave. So what happened when people would travel, for example, on a Saturday or a Friday, did not have to report for duty until the following Monday, and there was no reason to upgrade to a business class. And that's why they added that. That you have to be fresh to report to your TDY location and perform the mission of the agency. That's what was intended. And if there's an intervening day, like you're taking some annual leave before you have to begin your duty, then no, the agency should not authorize a business class upgrade for that purpose.
It's very interesting that that's the reason, because actually I think it has another effect, which is a very positive effect. What it used to say is, I think it said, if there's 14 hours and the person's not entitled to a rest stop, is what the language used to use. And we had, a lot of agencies had, I don't know if you remember, and one of these days I'm going to let go of this, but there was a GAO report many years back about abuse of business class travel in the government. And what GAO found to have been abusive was that people were flying business class when their trip took over 14 days, or over 14 hours, but they were able to sleep before the next day. And that is not a rest period. But in fact, I had a nomination fail because the person appropriately used the 14-hour rule, but GAO and the Congressional Committee read it differently than this.
Well, you can be given a day room, for example, the day you arrive.
Correct.
And that's considered a rest stop. So you don't get both. You get a rest stop, or you get the upgrade.
But they were interpreting a rest stop to mean if you got in at 11 o'clock at night and had to go to work at 8 o'clock the next morning, that was a rest stop. And that's, I think I argued a long time with them that that's not what rest stop meant. This makes it clear that that's not what rest stop means, because these people were all required to appear the next day.
Yeah. And we tell agencies, this is your discretion.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the facts. When is the person arriving? When do they have to report for duty? How long was the flight? I mean, take that all into account. It's not an entitlement. The only one that's entitlement is the disability, the medical disability.
There's one other point I want to make, and Lenny talked about the person needing to arrive and being rested. The other violation that GAO was quick to find in that case was where people were authorized to fly business class because they had to get off the plane and go right to work, and the agency wanted them to be fresh. And GAO didn't accept that as a rationale. All I'm telling you, and I hesitate to tell you this, but if you're going to use that, if you're going to use the business necessity reason, frankly, I think that's a pretty darn compelling business necessity argument. Just be aware that your agency might be second guessed about it. But I mean, we support the missions of our agencies within the ethics rules. And many times it makes a lot of sense that if you've got a person flying overseas and it's going to go right into a negotiation or something like that, you want that person to be arrested. I think that's precisely what that language was put in there for. You are subject to being second guessed if the agency is subject to being second guessed if they use that. And you know, we're all big boys and girls.
Is anybody here from GAO? Good. Then I'm going to say this. That should be outside the purview of GAO. If the flight is in excess of 14 hours, the regulations are clear. The agency uses its rightful discretion to make that determination. Now, if there was some abuse, that's different. But for them to say, well, we don't think that person should have, it was over 14 hours, and we just, well, that, you know, that, I probably would have responded back to GAO.
I would have responded
With
too,
that,
but my chief of staff wouldn't let me.
Well, you know, I mean, that's.
And I would have done with great restraint, you can be assured. Yeah, no, just be aware that this is one of those areas that's looked at very closely. And even though your agency feels that it makes perfect sense to put someone on business class because you need them fresh the next day, and I think that's exactly what this exception is allowed for. Just do it with your eyes open, that you might be criticized for it. That doesn't mean don't do it, but you should probably tell your person that there is that risk.
The next, and probably the last formal topic we'll take a look at is one that we've talked about for many years, and I don't know whether you've covered already, Dave, in some of the other sessions. When do I use 1353? When do I use WAG? When do I use Foreign Gifts Act? And even Training Act authorities. But we get a lot of calls, probably more calls about 1353 versus WAG. And you know, it's real simple. If usually, but if you're at your duty station, the only authority is WAG, basically, right? If you're in a travel status, normally we use 1353 if it's a meeting or symbol of function, and it falls within the definition of a meeting and symbol of function. And a meeting and symbol of function, as most of you know, does not include those kinds of activities that's necessary to carry out your mission. Investigations, audit, inspections, those are not considered meetings or symbol of functions. And you certainly, as an agency, when you do the conflict of interest analysis, wouldn't want the very organization that's being inspected, audited, or investigated paying for the travel of the investigator, auditor, or the inspector. So what if it's a meeting or a symbol of function, use 1353. If it's associated with the purpose of the travel. Let me explain what I mean by that. If you're going to a meeting or a symbol of function and there's an event in the evening that's on the agenda, it may be entertainment, it may be dining, it may be a dinner of some sort that others at the meeting or symbol of function are all invited to. That can be accepted under 1353. If you look at the federal travel regs, it says it includes a waiver of the registration fees, it includes meals, and it includes those kind of items attendant to the meeting that may not be reimbursable. And they say things like sporting events, entertainment that folks are invited to during the course of that meeting or symbol of function. That can be accepted under 1353. But what about if you're on a travel to a meeting or symbol of function and there's a totally separate event for which you did not travel? Let's say you travel to an ethics meeting in Chicago, but during the time that you're in Chicago happens to be an ABA convention going on totally separate meeting, and they have an evening event. Is that accepted under 1353? You're in a TDY status, you're on a travel status, but that's not the reason for your travel. That's not why you're on official travel orders. So what we advise agencies, when the event is not in connection with the purpose of the travel for which travel orders were issued, accept that other event under the WAG rules, okay? So that is an exception to when you're in a travel status, normally you accept under 1353. And if it's part of the meeting or symbol of function. If it's not, use the WAG rules, okay? Question? Okay, the question that was asked is, if there's insufficient funds to send an employee on official travel, can the employee, I mean, to break it down, fund the remainder of that travel? Well, an employee is not considered a non-federal source. And the problem that you have with an employee where there's insufficient funds, once you put an employee on official travel orders, they're entitled by law to reimbursement. And even if the employee says, oh, well, I'm volunteering not to voucher for a portion because you have insufficient funds, but I really want to go to that meeting. Once you put that on travel orders, they have 6 years to come back and assert a claim against the agency, because it is an obligation of the agency to fund the travel of that employee. Okay? With one exception, that is for training. For training, the Training Act provides that that the agency can pay all of or a portion of travel for training. So there is some authority on the Training Act, but that's a different authority.
And that's 5 USC 4111.
4111, that's right. If it's a training event, and there's a Civilian Board of Contract Appeals case that addresses that, yes, the employee, you can even put them on no-cost travel orders. That's the one time that you can actually put someone on travel orders if it's for training under the Training Act, and you have to annotate that. But for all other travel, once you put an employee on travel orders, if they volunteer to pay a portion of it, that is unenforceable. And there's a slew of GAO decisions right on that point, saying that basically an employee waiving his or her right to travel reimbursement is unenforceable if that employee changes his or her mind.
I think it works both ways.
It doesn't matter if they're getting training under the Training Act, that's a different authority, different analysis, a different result. We're talking about training. We're talking about travel to give us a talk, whether it's for training or any other purpose. They're put under travel orders, and they're entitled to reimbursement for the full for that full travel. Okay, so
this is interesting. I guess I want an answer to this question. What if someone's on personal travel? I mean, let's turn it around. Someone's on personal travel on vacation,
mm-hmm.
and but there's something going on in the town where he's on vacation, and it's something he wants to go to. It's official duties. For example, I went to Africa a year ago on personal travel. But while I was in, while I was in Kenya, I called the embassy and said, is there anyone here who would be interested in talking to me? Anyone here I can talk to about government ethics that they would find that to be useful? And they said, yeah, we have someone we'd love to have you talk to. And I did that. I didn't, I guess I don't know if I was put on orders or not, but
I was going to say, first of all, you have two issues. You've got travel, for the time that you were there, you authorized to receive travel. If you don't have any travel orders, no, there's not going to be any reimbursement. The other part of it is official time. For the portion of the time that you were taking to have official discussions, they would take you off of annual leave and put you on official.
So that wouldn't be on travel orders. That would be why.
That's always what dictates reimbursement
that makes sense.
For travel, unless it was emergency travel and you have to do it after the fact. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Actually, I did. But yeah, because I called the embassy and said, do you want me talking to these people? When they gave me country clearance. But that's a good point.
Yeah, but that wouldn't dictate necessarily whether on official time or
that's
not.
a different issue.
You may have violated the process if you don't. Your agency has to determine that part of your travel is for the purpose of going to that other event. The question was, can an agency actually authorize you to go to both? Well, if it's in the interest of the agency for you to attend that other event during travel, and the agency then accepts under 1353, so the travel authorization will note that you're attending two meetings. Remember, it has to be a meeting, that you're attending a meeting for one purpose and this other event is of interest in combination. If this other event is purely entertainment, I'm just wondering how they're going to arrive at the fact that that was a meeting.
Yeah. Meeting or similar event.
So that again, I would, depending on the facts, you might have to use the WAG exception. Okay. Okay. And then the one other acceptance is under the Foreign Gifts Act. And, that's very limited. And we get into all these discussions, one of the criteria has to be wholly outside the United States. So, we used to argue that the entire trip has to be outside the United States. And then Department of State, Department of Justice took a look at it and said, well, actually, it can begin in the United States and end in the United States. But if you're getting lodgings overseas, the lodgings portions is wholly outside the United States. Or if you have to fly from Washington to London, and then you're flying from London to Paris, that leg of the trip is wholly outside the United States. So there are circumstances when an employee can accept from a foreign government travel expenses, but that's in their personal capacity. It has to be reported. We always urge, if you can accept under 1353, if it's a meeting or similar function, except even from a foreign government, that's included in the definition of a non-federal source, except have the agency accept it under 1353. Okay. If it's not a meeting or similar function, then maybe you get into the into the Foreign Gifts Act, but then it has to be, again, wholly outside the United States. They cannot pay for the leg of the transportation or the travel that begins in the United States and ends overseas, okay, or returns to the United States. That's not wholly outside the United States. It's kind of a quirky provision, but it actually comes, as many of you know, comes from the Constitution under what's called the Emoluments Clause. So everybody takes it serious. That happens to be a constitutional provision. So that's how Congress enacted it.
Right, and the Foreign Gifts and Decoration Act predates 1353.
It sure does.
And so you
it sure does.
So I've done it under both the Foreign Gifts and Decorations Act and 1353. Once you have 1353, why would you bother with the Foreign Gifts and Decorations Act anymore? Unless you didn't learn about the expense until more than 7 days after the trip. That was, but that's a bad reason to use the FGDA. But yeah, I'm just curious, do any of you use foreign gifts and decorations for travel, or do you, instead of 1353? And why is that? Ah, yes, right.
But again, how do you get to that foreign country? Oh boy.
I don't know that.
So you would be, the agency would be, the only way to accept that, even whether it's in kind or payment by cash, is under 1353. You could not accept a ticket or payment from the United States to the overseas location. That's not wholly outside the United States. But
well, that's interesting.
okay. That's perfect.
Yeah, on your travel report, probably don't use the term wad of cash, but
I thought you got me nervous there when you said they gave you the ticket.
no, that's very creative. I thought that's very interesting. I can see why you'd do that. That's good.
No, you don't
need the gift.
You don't need gift acceptance authority for 1353. That is the gift acceptance authority for travel to, for travel, for payments from a non-federal source. That is the authority.
Okay. Are you?
Oh, and by the way, that's a good point. If you have gift acceptance authority and the travel is not to a meeting or similar function, then 1353 does not enter into the equation, and then your agency has to determine whether they can accept the travel payments under the gift acceptance authority of your agency. But it has to be something other than a meeting or similar function, okay? Otherwise, 31 USC 1353 is the only authority to accept, for the agency to accept. I'm sorry, there's a question. A foreign government? Man. Is NATO, United Nations, the World Health Organization, are they considered foreign governments? I got to tell you,
I'm betting we have an answer
international
back
organizations, but I'll let Thank you.
It's always good. I knew there was an answer. I just didn't know what it was.
Thank you.
Well, that's clearly a foreign government, yeah. Just not a function. No.
Thank you.
We got about 5 minutes.
No, not for travel.
For travel.
Not for travel. Usually it's, I think the minimal value now is 375, and which means you can accept under 375. Over 375, either reject it or you turn it into your agency. But for travel, there is no maximum. There is no maximum. 375 does not apply. Sure.
Okay, is that it? Or?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Dave, I want to thank you for
Well,
having me as a guest, as always.
As always, Lenny's a great guest because you just let him go. Don't have to. At any rate, so travel may not be directly in the ethics portfolio, and it's probably not in your initial ethics briefing to these people. We're focusing on conflicts of interest, gifts, and things like that. But it is an area that people frequently screw up or get crosswise on. So you need to familiarize yourself with those things, particularly with the home travel. Employees often do self-help kind of things, and the way they do it is probably reasonable, but not right. So it's important to talk to them ahead of time. The business class travel, I mean, we are all familiar with the business class travel rules. A lot of these guys are coming from places where it would just boggle their minds to think that a senior executive would be put in coach when he was going to a business meeting. I mean, one thing we always say the standards for government are different than the standards for business, but I mean, these businesses have fiduciary duties to use their money wisely too, and they've made the determination that it doesn't make sense. It's not good business to put someone on a coach class flight when they're going to do business the next day. So they're coming in with this mindset. It's going to, unless you tell them they can't use business classes, they're not going to know that. So this is an area where a little preventative medicine is really helpful. So I urge you to think about these issues as you do your initial ethics training. It's an area where people often make mistakes, and because the light is so good, it's an area where people are looking for mistakes. So with that, thank you, Lenny.
Yeah, my
It's
pleasure.
been a pleasure working with you, and have a good evening, folks.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the National Government Ethics Summit. We've just heard from OGE's General Counsel Dave Apel and Leonard Lowentritt from the General Service Administration, and that concludes the festivities for today. So what do we have to look forward to tomorrow?
So we have a number of sessions that we're very excited about tomorrow. I think it's important that we just take a moment and let you know that we're going to start streaming at around 8:55 in the morning, and both this stream and the stream 2 will be going. Will also be live at 9 o'clock with the morning sessions.
And again, those are on the separate playlists on the youtube.com/OGE Institute page. And if you missed anything today or yesterday, those recordings are available immediately for your viewing pleasure.
Yeah, today was especially riveting with the ethics recommendations for the new administration. I highly recommend that one.
Yes, I'm actually looking forward to going back and watching Liz's interview with Norm and Richard Painter.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so for all of us here at OGE, we'll see you tomorrow.